Hello and welcome to the fifth in our well-versed sequence of events, which features poets who featured at StAnza 2022 in an exploration of the relationship between, or exploring the role of narrative in poetry. This evening's featured poet needs very little introduction to those of you who are StAnza fans. But for anyone unfamiliar with their work, Fiona Benson is the author of three collections of poetry in a pamphlet. Three of these are with Cape Poetry: Bright Travellers, which won the Seamus Heaney First Collection Award and Geoffrey Faber Memorial Prize; Vertigo and Ghost, which won the Forward Prize for Best Collection; and the recent Ephemeron. She's also had published a really beautiful and fascinating pamphlet called Bioluminescent Baby with one of my favourite publishing houses, Guillemot Press. And one of its poems, Mama Cockroach, I Love You, was shortlisted for the Forward Best Poem Prize 2020. So a huge welcome here to StAnza's well-versed series of events this evening, Fiona. As I've already said, StAnza 2022 explored the role of narrative in poetry. And in this context, Fiona's a fascinating writer to discuss these questions with, through her interest in drawing upon, revisiting and rewriting myths, plus the importance she places upon notions of truth in her writing. But before we delve into why this might be the case and to explore some of these questions, can I maybe invite you to share a poem with us, Fiona, to get us going for the evening, and maybe to explain why you've chosen to start us off with this poem.
Okay, thank you, Lucy, for that lovely introduction. I'm going to read a poem from Ephemeron. I'm going to read a poem from the translations from the Pasiphae section. So this retells the story of the Minotaur from the perspective of his mother, Pasiphae, who is mostly remembered now, if at all, through the lens of sexual deviance. You know, you often see her represented in art, copulating with a bull and so on. So my retelling was trying to rescue her from that a little bit. And also Tracy K. Smith has spoken about how sometimes poems begin with a concern or a worry for her. And I feel like I had this worry about the poor old Minotaur. And I couldn't understand how a child, even if it was a child who was horned, or however myth represents him, would end up in the labyrinth. That seemed a great cruelty to me. And then I think I was exploring this and very drawn to it. And it all came together for me when I read about ancient Greece's treatment of disabled children who were often exposed, along with female children, actually. So unwanted children would be exposed. So I reimagined that Pasiphae keeps the child, which is a rather long introduction, but this is Ariadne's perspective on her brother Asterios the Minotaur, on Asterios' imprisonment in the labyrinth. Most people couldn't understand him. You had to listen. He had a way of speaking, some sounds, some signs: give, please, help, and usually about our mother, mine. Ma was mother, obviously. He called me Ni. He'd tilt his head if he wanted to be petted, could sway it for a no and nod for yes. Sometimes he was rough, but I could manage him. The trick was to kick him behind the knees and he'd fold like a pile of blocks. We had a sign for sorry. You patted your chest. Sometimes I find myself patting there still, that blighted, sorry place, as I apologize to him, lost in that faraway, forgetting zone. After his imprisonment, I'd lead him out at night. Daedalus showed me the way, the concealed door, the lock, the thread. At first, my brother would run like mad ahead of me along the path, head down, making his noise for happy, tacking back and forth. Often we went to the beach and swam in the dark, the water firing all round us with tiny phosphorescent sparks. He'd spout the water out of his mouth like a joyous black-furred dolphin. When he was tired, he'd lie on the damp sand and watch the extravagant sky, a little noise for each slipped star, the Milky Way reflected in his eyes. For months it was enough. But we are grandchildren of the sun. It sickens us not to feel its blaze. After a while, I could barely coax him out at night. And when we sat, all he would do was rest his head against his knees and slump and rock. Then he became so thin he could barely walk. I'd lead him tottering out and he'd sink to the ground, too weak to make the beach. He stank of piss. I was afraid but couldn't think of how to get him free. I made excuses to visit less and was ashamed. One night, he turned his face to me and tilted so I'd stroke his cheek and sign the words slowly, clearly. I heard them plain as if he'd placed them singly in my brain. Want, die. And then he made the sign for help. Brother, look at me now. I'm signing sorry. It took me months to say yes. It took me years to find a way. And by the time he came with his swagger and deceit, looking under his eyelashes at our sister, Phaedra, you'd lost all speech. You were eating your own feces. You didn't know me. You didn't know yourself.
Wow, thank you, Fiona. When we were just chatting before we came online, you said that there was quite a contrast between your use of myth in Ephemeron and your use of myth in Vertigo and Ghost. Was there a poem which you'd like to share with us from Vertigo and Ghost while we just get started, or would you rather?
Yeah, if you like. I mean, I think you know, because the ways of writing these poems came to me very differently. So the Zeus poems kind of came sideways, if you like that there was, you know, this issue of abuse and rape and that kind of power abuse. Had been something I'd been wanting to write about for a long time but hadn't found a way in. Okay. And then one night this idea of Zeus kind of just entered my head and took over, and then it was a lot more, in a way it was a lot more scattergun and a lot more about things I already, you know, we already know these stories through reading English literature. Basically, I'm not a classicist. This has all come through Hughes and God knows what else. But with the pacify section in Ephemeron, my latest book, that was different. That began with this worry about the story and trying to figure out, you know, I think I've got quite a pragmatic or kind of earthy understanding of the world. I'm quite literal. I wanted to know how that could possibly be that this child would be ostracized like that.
Okay, so it kind of came from different directions, whereas in Vertigo and Ghost, you had a subject matter of abuse, sexual violence, which you wanted to explore, and the idea of Zeus and that narrative provided a means for it. For the Ephemeron, there was the myth of Pasiphae, and that provided the starting point for everything which came from that. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shall I read a couple of the Zeus?
Yeah,
read some of the fragments from the beginning, shall I? So these were the kind of first ones that came through. So they're quite short, but I'll read 3 or 4 of them. Zeus. Days I talked with Zeus. I ate only ice. Felt the blood trouble and burn under my skin. Found blisters on the soft parts of my body. Bulletproof glass and a speakerphone between us, and still I wasn't safe. Thunder moved in my brain. Tissue crease, hemorrhage. I kept the dictaphone running. It recorded nothing but my own voice, vulcanized and screaming, "You won't get away with this." Archives, Zeus on parole. No fun. This ankle band tases me every time I brush the bounds, and yet it is, shall we say, erotic. Its sudden curse, its thrill. Archives. Zeus, given light sentence, temporary jail. The judge delivers that he is an exemplary member of the swimming squad. Look at his muscular shoulders, the way he forges through water. As for the girl. I think I'll stop there, Lucy.
Wow, thank you. I'm going to start off in terms of questions with a bit of a big question about the relationship between, on one hand, truth, mythology, and violence, which kind of run through and kind of intertwine some of your writing. The notion of truth is quite often brought up in relation to your work, and yet it's quite interesting that your divisive choice to explore what can be at times very personal themes is mythology. Can you tell us a bit about what you feel that mythology offers truth, which may be a more directly confessional or directly sort of personal approach might not?
I think in fact I use both. Sometimes I use myth and sometimes I'm confessional. I wouldn't see the myth stuff taking up more than about a quarter of my work, really. So, but I have found myth useful, like I just said with the Zeus poems, for finding a way to handle quite hot material and to manage it. And then with the Pasiphae, I'm very interested in lost voices, whether that's, female voices or queer voices. I'm interested in, or, any kind of lost voice or suppressed voice, I'm really interested in. So kind of there are all these gaps in myth. The female is often not narrated or not narrated properly or skipped over by the narration or given a small bit part, which leaves immense room for exploration. And yeah, I've just enjoyed doing that. Yeah.
So would you say that your approach, it's a question, so why as a writer we keep on revisiting myths? I've certainly done so in relation to Icarus in one of my own collections. What for you is the purpose of revisiting myth? Is it that case of putting a new angle in stories? Are you changing the stories? I suppose with your with Vertigo and Ghost, you are drawing it on it as a device, but has your interest become more actually filling out the spaces and providing new angles? How do we make these new and continue to make them interesting? Why are writers so drawn to them, do you think?
Yeah, well, I think it's that thing, there being lots of gaps for your own imagination, especially as a woman writer coming to them. The female stories haven't been told, or they're also, myths tend to be very sketchy, don't they? But I don't like talking about myths on their own. I think they're part of this vast inherited kind of storytelling that gets passed on to us, which includes folk tales and fairy tales and songs. But anything that leaves nice gaps for the imagination, I think, is really rich territory.
Yeah, and as you rightly observe, it's not just myth, which in terms of your approach to your work, and I suppose that's maybe most clear in Ephemeron, which is kind of split 50-50 between the work which is more responding to exploring the myth of Pasiphae, and then a more kind of lyrical section. And I suppose that kind of split was most kind of apparent in that collection. Was thinking about kind of form here and formal decisions, was it a conscious decision that one section would be more lyrical, more confessional, more direct, and the other one, or was it just instinct? And that's
yeah, I think when I'm writing, it's just taking it one poem at a time. So actually those structures, although I guess that's the difference, is that Zeus and the Pasiphae section, they both have this kind of arc that I knew I was writing a series and was able to follow that series along, whereas other poems, although I sometimes think of them as albums, so though I might get an album of poems, they're often more arising from your subconscious somewhere. So that the arc of a series, I think, is quite helpful, because I don't like to not be writing, so to know what you're working on or towards, or the overarching theme, I think is really helpful. But actually that kind of grouping of the poems doesn't happen until very late stages. Yeah,
no, for sure. Another device which you use, I'm kind of fascinated between the relationship between, which I think narrative sometimes sort of brings to a head, this relationship between narrative and truth. So when I've been reading about your work, people's responses to your work, this notion of truth has come up quite frequently. But a lot of the devices you use, whether it's drawing upon mythology, whether it's, we heard very clearly in particularly the first extract you read there, the importance of characters, of dramatic monologue, a lot of devices which you'd perhaps mistakenly think of more as fictional devices necessarily than poetic devices. I'm being very generalizing here, but what to you is what is truth important to you? What do you mean by that? And how does that overlap with fiction and your use of dramatic devices and characters and voices? Sorry, there's 10 million questions in there, so you can choose whichever one you like.
Well, I think the truth thing is interesting. I think I've always, I do write confessionally quite a lot, and I've always tried to follow Sharon Olds's kind of principle that you should never worry about what you look like in a poem. So I can be quite exposing of myself, and I do push myself that way a little bit, I think, because I just want to be honest. I think there's lots of people not being honest a lot of the time, and that it doesn't help anybody. So for example, there's a section about being a teenage girl. I think there's a lot of shame that can come into teenage lives, and I kind of want to be honest about what being a teenager is like, so that maybe.
How do you cope with the vulnerability of that? I remember doing one reading, and usually my readings are really prepared and ordered, and I didn't on this occasion make people suggest a number. I'd read the poem from that page, and it was one of my probably few quite vulnerable poems, and I almost just burst into tears because I was just like, that's too vulnerable for this moment. How do you cope with that vulnerability of which is on the page, and that the exposing nature of that truth, as it were?
Well, sometimes I just don't read the poems.
Yeah.
I think, for me, like, writing the poems is quite a healing thing. So I I've just been teaching an Arvon course with Liz Berry, and we were talking about how you protect yourself. But actually, for me, the poem is a way of protecting myself. It's putting an experience into some kind of crafted form that I have some kind of control over, or so making it into a poem is my way of handling pain sometimes, or painful experiences. So if I do share them, it's because I'm hoping that it will also be helpful to other people. And I think so if I do read them out, that's why. But
yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, they do sometimes make you feel vulnerable, but if that emotion isn't there in the poem, then poem's probably not working. Yeah.
I like it. So what about fiction and fictional devices? So, what role does fiction play in truth?
I'm not sure I think of truth in this big overarching way. I think I take it poem by poem, and I think I love using narrative because I love other writers that use narrative. I love reading that kind of poem. I find it a very generous form. So it's something I've worked on, is kind of creating narratives and overarching narratives as well when I structure a book. But I think, and also I think a poem can do and use any form it wants to. And I'm very inspired by people that are quite experimental in their use of different genres, like Anne Carson, for example.
Yeah, fabulous.
Yeah, so I just like this idea that a poem can do anything and be anything. And if I ever talk about truth, it's probably in a poem by poem basis. I just want the poem to be true to itself. And be the best it can be. Yeah.
No, absolutely lovely. I'm going to I want to make sure there's a bit of time for at least another poem at the end. So one thing I didn't, I'm just going to move on really to a sort of last question. So one thing, one area of your work, I suppose, which I hadn't been aware of until preparing for this evening, was your work which explores the relationship between human narratives and the sort of flux and flow, I suppose, of, and I'll say this in scare quotes, of the natural world. How do you see this relationship between the human and non-human worlds? And perhaps it's an important question to be particularly asking in terms of our current moment. What do you feel that poetry can offer in terms of helping us understand and appreciate and empathize more with the natural world?
I was thinking recently about that beautiful Lucille Clifton poem about it's got this news report that the cockroaches are possibly in decline, and it imagines them prayerful and sad in the sink and kind of leaving, and that moment of the little cockroaches kind of trooping off being a moment of understanding that actually the world is coming to an end. And I think, the most recent lot of kind of nature poems has been these insect poems, and I think I see poetry very clearly and keenly as a way of looking at things and paying attention, being attentive and listening to things. And so, for example, there's also that wonderful Sean Hewitt Wild Garlic poem. And every time I see wild garlic, I pay it special attention because of this beautiful poem. So I think poetry can really be a lens that really concentrates your attention on the world. And so, things like the insect population is declining now. And in order to care for that, I like the idea of using poetry as a way to look into their tiny lives, because actually they're the other creatures we spend our lives with. We don't often see a big alpha badger or hedgehog, but we're always surrounded by tiny insects. So I wanted to use poetry as a way to pay attention to them, to find out about them, because you can't love what you don't know at all. and to celebrate their weirdness too, because we often have this kind of aversity to insects.
Yeah, I love that idea of poetry actually as a lens. I'm a keen photographer, and the one thing which, and I'm also a keen fell runner, and the one thing which encourages me to slow down in the fells is actually having a camera, to have that lens to actually encourage me to focus. I've never actually quite thought of poetry as a lens in that same kind of almost literal sense. Before we hear a poem from Bioluminescent Baby, which is probably where we will close. That's Fiona's pamphlet with Guillemot Press. I just wanted to ask one last question, we've still got a few more minutes, about, so that was developed, am I right, as a commission from Exeter University in collaboration both with sound artists and a woodcut printer, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So there was an open call for projects on the theme of urgency. So me and Maya Bosworth, who's a radio producer, put together this idea of interviewing scientists and recording insects and embedding a poem in the sound piece. And Eliza Lomas joined in later.
So how did you feel in terms of working in collaboration with artists in different forms? How did the three different forms combine in telling these almost like little love stories about insects?
Yeah,
how did you work together? How did you extend each other? How did they play off each other?
Yeah, the woodcuts came in later, so they came after the poems had been written. They're beautiful.
Stunning.
Yeah, but the poems, it was so lovely, Lucy, to be working with somebody else and doing the research together, because actually usually you're just alone in your room, aren't you? So me and Maya went and researched insects together and interviewed people together, and it was that's just a lovely thing to be able to work with somebody in this discipline and to share that work of discovery.
Yeah, it kind of becomes an organic thing of discovery, doesn't it, rather than I suppose you working together, contrasting with the woodcutting relationship print being later. Okay, well, and where we are drawing to a close, so would you be kind to share a poem from
I might read Mama Cockroach.
Yeah, go on.
Because it's kind of a funny one, and because I mentioned the Lucille Clifton lovely cockroach poem, if I can find it. So a lot of the insect poems are also in Ephemeron, I should say. So the whole project is in Bioluminescent Baby, but then there's a section of insect love songs in Ephemeron, and this is one of them, and it's about cockroaches. I don't really like cockroaches. I had to find a way to like cockroaches, and this is what happened. Mama Cockroach, I love you. Because you cozy with the aunties in your reeking slums and are intimate and sweet. Because you begrudge no one a meal, but ooze a fecal trail to lead your commune to its source, like a dirty bee. Because you are joyfully promiscuous. Because you pouch your young and hide them in the sweaty creases of the house near suppurating food so they'll hatch to a feast. Or keep your eggs with you in a special purse shaped like a kidney bean and clutch it fast. Or reinsert them into your abdomen and womb them there. Or carry them as yolks and give live birth. Then feed your pale brood secretions from your anus or your armpit glands, like milk. Or deep in the flesh of a rotten log, pass them a bolus of pre-digested food, mouth to mouth. Because you suffer your young to swarm upon your back, and do not flinch or buck them off, but carry them, like a human playing horsey with her children, down on hands and knees, decrying the swag of her own loose flesh. Because you twirl your antennae gracefully to test your crawl space. Because strokingly you caress your offspring's backs and gentle them with pretty pheromones and chirps. because you purr when your young stroke your face, because you would leave your body for your offspring to dine upon, all the liquors and gravy of the obscene world, your work in the crannies delivered to the living, because you are, despite all rumours, mortal. And what if you are crushed before your eggs can be delivered? What if your sisters drive you hissing out? What if your kitchen is fumigated? What if the mongoose, the lizard, the snake, a muscular tongue prying at the warm and greasy interstices of your stubborn occupancy takes you in its mouth? Someone must care for the dirt.
Fabulous. Thank you, Fiona. Yeah, huge thanks to Fiona for joining us this evening. I feel like we keep on talking for hours and hours and hours.
Thank you for having me, Lucy. Thank you.
No, it's been an absolute delight. Those of you who are watching, if you'd like to check in again next week, goodbye from Fiona. If you'd like to check in, not next week, next month, we've got Luke Kennard engaging in what I'm sure will be a very different discussion. And then the month after that, we've got Nizzy Zach, and then that'll be the end of the series for this year. And then, but Well-Versed will be returning next year after a short break in the summer, exploring topics which I can't release the theme yet, but will be relevant to next year's festival. But once again, huge thanks to Fiona. Thanks for joining us tonight. This will, if you want to revisit this will be available to watch over the course of the next month up on our website. And thanks for joining us again. I hope it's nicer weather than it is here tonight, where it's majorly stormy.